In Europe, we have three main groupings of languages. The Romance languages, which we find in Southern or Mediterranean Europe. Then there's the Germanic languages, more there in Northern Europe. And then in Eastern Europe, the Slavic languages. Now, there are more to this. There's a couple more. There's much more nuance in this. It's a very simplified map, but I'm going to try to just showcase by dovetailing with a lot of cultural characteristic, even the physical geography characteristic here and there, to try to understand more about the diversity from one country to the next, from one region to the next, in the case of Europe. So in good educator fashion, we'll start off with not talking about one of those three major groups or major families of languages. We'll first off talk about the Uralic, which sounds like if you're a middle-aged male, the last thing you want to hear. But Uralic are actually languages that originate, as the name implies, near the Ural Mountains. And so what we have is we have a group that were nomadic. In this group, these nomadic tribes, they ventured across eastern Russia and Ukraine, and they ended up in Eastern Europe. But another group of them also ended up in Finland. And so here we have this group of nomadic tribesmen who split up in their journey, split up and went different directions. And then over time, they've kind of remained isolated, and they've been able to resist years of different groups kind of coming in and ruling over them. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Hungarian, which is stuck there right in the middle of Eastern Europe. They're just south of the Slovak Republic or Slovakia. So what's going on there? So here is, once again, not one of the three main language families. And so the particular type of Uralic language there is, go figure, it's Hungarian. And so what happened over time is, if you look at the geography of Hungary, it's actually surrounded by mountains. It's kind of in the bottom of a bowl. And so what that's done is it's kind of allowed them to be isolated, to kind of been able to kind of claim this particular area for a good amount of time since the late 800s, when they migrated those nomadic groups from essentially Russia. And if you think about the geography also in Hungary, it's very flat, very much a grassland, which, go figure, you would find in those nomadic areas which they originated there in Russia and up there by the Ural Mountains. And so the Uralic we also see in Finland. Now, it's a different variety. Now, if you went to Finland and said, if you're Hungarian, you went to Finland and tried to talk, they would have no idea what you're saying. It's very similar to how English and German are part of the same language family. But we are nowhere near similar, and nowhere near could you be able to speak German, if you're grow up your whole life in Bargersville, Indiana. But we see Finland as another one of these groups, these Uralic, but also Estonia. And so there's the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But you look at Estonia, especially South Estonia, and you'll actually see there kind of a unique dialect of the Finnish language, which makes sense. It's just across the water, a small little water body from Finland. Now let's talk about the Slavic languages. You see the map on the left shows the three main groupings. So we have the Western Slavs in light green, the Eastern Slavs in dark green, and I guess we'll call them the Southern Slavs there in the Balkan Peninsula, the former Yugoslavia area. The main differences is you'll see different dialects, different pronunciation characteristics, but also different alphabet. I'm not going to go into the nuances of it, but those are the main reasons why they're not all just the same color in terms of the variations. So let's go through each of these country by country. Let's start off with the Western Slav. So we have the Czech and Slovak. So Czech Republic will soon be called Czechia if it hasn't already. And then the Slovak Republic is now called Slovakia. It used to be one country called Czechoslovakia. But what happened there was the split up of these two countries makes a lot of sense because in Czechia, they speak the Czech language. And further, if you ask people in Czechia, what is your ethnicity? They'd say, well, 94% of them would say, well, we're Czechia. We speak the Czech language. Whereas in Slovakia, 86% of them would say we're Slovakian and we speak the Slovakian language. Go up to Poland. Poland here is a good example of a nation state, in which it's very much ethnically Polish. And guess what? They also speak Polish. which once again is different than Russian, because you can see Russia's in that dark green category. And so I had two roommates. One was from Poland, the other one was from Russia, and they could kind of talk to each other because there was some similarities between these two different groupings of Slavic languages. Key to also, I'll talk about this more a little bit later with Poland, is they're Roman Catholic, which also makes it a little bit different than the rest of the Slavic countries, especially those there in the dark green. Now let's go to the dark green Slavic countries. So let's start off with the Baltic countries. And so I already talked about Estonia, but Latvia and Lithuania are two examples of Baltic languages. And so these are the two they're really, I guess they're sort of Slavic. They're part of the Balto-Slavic group, but they are somewhat unique. But they kind of originate from Prussia. I'm not going to talk too much about history, but from the era of the Prussians. But anyway, so the key here is you have Latvia and Lithuania were two former Soviet republics, so they are part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, they then became their own countries. So they're different dialects, essentially, of the same language, Lithuanian and Latvian. Next up are two countries in which I wouldn't be surprised if in our lifetime they become part of Russia, especially Belarus. So in Belarus, 83% of the population is what we would call Belarusian. So it's, once again, a form of a Slavic language. But yet only 12% of the population speaks that language. What do the majority of the population already speak? What we can see is in that kind of the darker lime green, Russian. So over 3/4 of the population speaks Russian. So almost Belarusian is becoming slowly but surely endangered, kind of archaic, especially as more and more of the young people speak Russian. So this is something I'll talk more about in the geopolitics maybe, but Belarus is essentially a puppet state of Russia. What that means is it's essentially a part of Russia. It's its own country, but for the most part, whatever Russia says, they'll be like, cool, we agree with that. Next up is Ukraine. So Ukraine, which is just south of Belarus there people speak Ukrainian, especially, over 3/4 of the population speak it. But there are nearly about 20% of the population that also speaks Russian, particularly there in the eastern part of Ukraine. So this is something you're going to continue to see and hear more about as Russia tries to claim more areas beyond the Russian borders, and so try to maybe reclaim some of those former Soviet republics, with one of those being Ukraine. And they've already started to do this. If we look down just in the southern part of Ukraine, you see the peninsula of the Crimea. And so the Crimean Peninsula, you can see it's colored lime green, whereas Ukraine is colored in that yellow color. That lime green is technically part of Ukraine. However, it's overwhelmingly ethnically Russian. And more recently, Vladimir Putin has come in and said, hey, this is ethnically Russian. There's also a lot of key gas and pipelines through here. So why not start to claim this area as our own? And I'll come back and I'll further explain this at the end of this chapter when I look at the geopolitical complications in this part of the world. And finally, the most influential and the biggest of all the Slavic countries is, of course, Russia. Now, something you'll notice in Russia, you see all that green there inside the borders of the country. But you notice there's a lot of other colors in there. And so Russia, people don't realize it. They think of it being, oh, everyone's the same. They're all Russians. They're all a bunch of commies. Well, actually, that's not the case. And so they're very, very diverse. In fact, Russia is the world's largest multi-nation state. Now, it's not in terms of area. That's in terms of the number of nations within one state. Russia is number one. And we can kind of see that, the complexity of those different overlapping groups, especially when you get out to more of those remote areas, a little bit further away from the economic and population core of Russia in the western part over here on this side, the western side of the Ural Mountains. Next up is the Southern Slavs. And once again, this is a very simplified view of things. In most cases, the national borders and the ethnic borders or the language borders, they don't always correspond well, especially in this particular region. And I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. So what we got is we have the Western Slavic, the Western Southern Slavs and the Eastern Southern Slavs. The Western would be Slovenian, Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, and Montenegrin. And then there in the Eastern would be Bulgarian and Macedonian. What's the reason for the difference is that different times, different moments, different eras, the Albanians kind of separated this group, then the Romanians separated, then the Hungarians, and so essentially you have these two different groups, both Southern Slavic, both very similar on the continuum of language families, but because of that separation, especially during certain times, it created these two differences. Now I'll go ahead and start off with the Eastern Slavs. So first off, we have Bulgarian, which were ethnically Bulgarian, and we have Macedonian, which were ethnically Macedonian. Now, these are very similar. I mean, they're talking about the dialects, the accent, very small variations between these two. And so some would say, actually, Macedonian isn't really its own language. It's really, they're just speaking Bulgarian. They're just speaking their own version, some of their own words and all of that. Differences also between these two countries, Macedonia and Bulgaria. Bulgaria is more of an Orthodox Christian country, whereas Macedonia has a mix of Eastern Orthodox, about 2/3, and it's 1/3 Muslim. Further, if we look at Macedonia, it's actually a contentious name. The Greeks say, no, you can't use that name Macedonia, because that's an area of Greece. So if you ever see Macedonia at global level in terms of sports, I believe, for example, their football team, so i.e. soccer, they're referred to as FYR Macedonia because they are the former Yugoslav Republic. So I think helps explain kind of a little bit differences between Macedonia and Bulgaria, which basically there is no differences. Now let's go to the Western Southern Slav. And so there's, for the most part, that kind of mustardy, puke green color we see for Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro. We'll just go ahead and lump those in to the group. We'll call it the Serbo-Croatian dialect or family. But then north of that, we see the Slovenian. All of this is, for the most part, we think about these individual countries are part of the former Yugoslav country that has since broke up and become these individual countries. And Slovenia actually has their own version of the Serbo-Croat language. So different vocab, different grammar, different punctuation than you would find with the puke green countries there. And so we see the Serbo-Croatian. That's going to include Bosnian, Herzegovina, Serbian, Croat, Montenegrin. And so it's shown here as this puke green color, but trust me, it's much more complex than that. Especially when we tie in other cultural stuff besides language. And so ethnicity, ethnic groups, or religion in this particular area where we saw the Serbo-Croat language, that puke green color. Now we can see all different types of colors. So ethnically, there's a lot of variation within that one language group. Further, you see different religions. In Croatia, the Roman Catholic. Bosnians are actually Sunni Muslims. Serbs are Orthodox Christians. And so you have this patchwork of different dialects, different languages, different religions. Key to understanding, there's two different reasons, of many. First off, this is very rugged terrains. And so once again, rugged areas, you're going to have more isolation. You're going to have on one side of a mountain a different group and on the other side a different ethnic group. Another key is you had the Ottoman Empire ruled over this area relatively recently, up until the early part of the 20th century. So the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey, they weren't really concerned about converting this area. And so especially in those rural, more remote, more isolated areas, different language groups, different religion groups could kind of remain isolated, but then also remain still intact because they weren't overrun and wiped out by a particular colonial group, not like the Germans or the Russians. it was in fact the Ottoman Empire, and they weren't really interested in conquering and converting everyone into this particular area. They're just more kind of maintaining their particular empire. In this particular area, there are also two more examples of isolated languages. And so in Albania, so it's very close to that Serbo-Croat area, what are they? They're ethnically Albanian. So we think about Albania as far as its origins, still to be determined. I mean, still something which historians are trying to figure out, where did this particular language come from? Could be kind of combinations of other languages, but it's still to be determined. So it's an example of an isolated language family. Another good example of an isolated language is Greek. So although it's very well known, we know a lot of people know the Greek alphabet, especially if you're in fraternities and sororities, but kind of an interesting fact, it's the longest, or shall we say the oldest language that's been documented over time. So it's continuously been documented for nearly 3,500 years, in which we've seen the Greek alphabet being used, which is believed to be the oldest continuing usage of a particular language in the world.